2912.
Obviously turn to the officer's detailed comment. Broad point. Act is not necessary. This scale of appropriate those apart from that particular circuit.
I think just to reiterate that the evidence that's London, again, the Andrew says have a strategic and say that we liability is have got scale but recognize that is not now clear again. Significant difference.
To the various components. on the need. Very little difference. So at the risk.
I think, Mum, perhaps it's worth emphasising at this stage. Do it. But this is, once you're satisfied that it's not negligible, then precise extent sites is perhaps need. Once one can say that negligible sites, then the issue is it tap that? Determining that, we say it's the need that is number.
Impact.
Take that point entirely, but it just, I think it's important not be fixated on that. Ever potential because of the crisis. And yeah, well, that's what I said. My qualifying point, negligible. Really are evidence. Conceptual point. Buying.
It's a
What I'm saying, and without wanting to repeat myself, is that when you look at that equation, you say the two-sided, we say that the heavy weighty sided
friends that can bring.
Certainly take that. Talked about requirement is significant. We can demonstrate that that's in figure well that we
makes a bring in components of the next question. Actual the pencil that
And I think we felt that it clarity to
it's just a more modern um um the evidence.
the evidence is again going back to housing assessment, chapter 5. And what that clearly genuinely other 10 given genuine housing is that are not prohibiting think that is adopted across. But also add that it's not any sure what the that is absolutely.
Words in the kind of paraphrasing. Prejudice.
Correct, yeah, chapter 5.
Own feeling. There is the
If I can open, Inspector Malloy, for clarity, Council and indeed its local plan is extremely supportive of bringing vacant, underused sites back into. I believe that is clear. Search across fields that appear turning vacant sites back into use of successful and sustainable placemaking, which the council is committed to. So certainly we aren't, as a local planning authority, are not seeking stand in the way of that. That is. Nevertheless, as I think we've heard, I think very eloquently the discussion further. There is an established need homes of genuinely and the viability evidence sits alongside I think serves to demonstrate, I believe, serves to demonstrate that there is sufficient viability in sites that will come that they don't need the come forward. Because I think, just again, for clarity, vacant building credit is specifically introduced nationally, the one-size-fits to encourage the reuse of sites, vacant and whilst that approach may work in a nation where sites are more quick, need a financial incentive to that is not and just to summarize in relation to this, I think, to paraphrase yourself, Inspector Malloy, whilst the inspector considering position acknowledged that London Plan strategic document council it has at the borough level.
Said that.
I think, to be honest, and to answer your question, if I was to do a word search of the viability assessment that specified vacant building credit, I would not come across that specific reference, just the same as if you do a word search across the NPPF, you don't credit either in there. Nevertheless, the viability assessment does present, I think, strong evidence of viability across the borough, and it's there. It's a proportionate piece of evidence that serves the local.
2 points. You're on point to me. Timeline again. Vision. Clearer picture in terms of maintaining it's including vibe. The other question. Well, it's just in the area leading it. Those are all
In an attempt to cover some of those sequentially, if I may. Tracy wants to come.
I was going to say just this. I mean, again, similar way to the way we discussed how to weight the equation for site. Important, I think, to focus on the underlying rationale. That's the yardstick, really, again, to assess a decision. Rationale is the additional costs, ability to be if housing requirements. Therefore, is there any suggestion that distance that it has has facilitated wouldn't have come. Add on to that, there isn't any evidence we've found distance of otherwise. And it's really important, again, focus on the need side. Reason affordable. It's got to be justified.
Councillors.
Yeah, we'll draw it, obviously. Again, it's just
I think
If I may, Inspector Malloy, I've taken a note of your request. I think as I hope we've had an indication so far, we are on day 3, so as I'm certain we will over the remainder of the. You will have a clear picture of the sources of supply that are available in the borough. You have both visited the borough. You see the nature of the borough and the nature of those sources of supply. There is evidence, proportionate evidence, the Council has produced on these. We can disaggregate that in terms of the potential that may come from previously developed sites. We can certainly disaggregate that in terms of the site allocations and the potential that exists from small sites and other windfalls. Without wishing to deal any plot spoilers, in fact, it will be very high. So we can certainly do that, aggregate that and submit it to the. I think that in concert with the other evidence there on need and the other evidence clearly there on Council does have a strong case. I think you will get sick of us telling you that Lewisham and Capital are different from other parts of the country, and I genuinely believe, my limited experience is that is genuinely the case here within this context.
I think it's
Just one final point, just to note within suggestion is a proportionate. That gives us consideration.
the exceptional
would it be possible to back on that?
accessibility. Get past. Unless the council had any. I'm just. Okay then. So in terms of information for. I.
Thank you. Question in majority of I really want practical relationship between rent and change of sure that doesn't ever up has been to rent yes, absolutely right. Between generally speaking, accepted social rent but is the more as I said, the evidence within demonstrate both products generally that is why we effectively call in terms of being absolutely have is a fairly consistent. Absolutely right. Does need to clear distinction. Yes, I'm certain that the London again, you said just for house assure me that that includes
moving on, pose the question, evidence. Approach set out.
I think if I may, to open, that the council is committed existing and future, and all its communities existing and future, and that extends to a clear cognizance of the fact that we are all that we will all need accommodation into. The approach that it takes is in accordance with the London plan, and I think equally in accordance with national policy, is one of resilience within existing and housing stock, so that the majority of that need is met through conventional housing. That approach is clearly set out in policy. So within the supporting text, the technical evidence is set out at the strategic level by the London plan, and the London-wide strategic housing market assessment. That is set out under supporting text paragraph 7. And as per the council's response at the local level, plan making has been informed by strategic housing assessment.
Maybe. Yeah, I think just I don't. slightly longer. Does it just sound that's
Yes, can you hear me? Can you, did you say that the feed is catching up or? Yep. Okay, yeah, no problem at all. Shall I say testing, testing? Testing, testing, 1, 2, 3. 1, 2. I've seen musicians do this. 1, 2. 1, 2, testing. Testing. Just to say we are having some technical issues, if you can hear me, which we're trying to resolve if I am being broadcasted. Testing.
Is anybody out?
Testing, testing. 1, 2, 3. Hopefully people can hear me. Can you hear me? Excellent. We seem to be back. Excellent. Okay.
Thank you.
Are we? Excellent. Okay. Apologies, we're back. We have sound in the live streaming. Apologies for that.
And if I may get back into character swiftly,
Thought you were going to sing us a song there for a moment.
maybe later. The Lewisham Strategic Housing Market Assessment deals with this with quite a considerable amount of detail. So the specific references for your attention are from page 50 onwards. So it is paragraphs 6.6 of the Lewisham Schma through to paragraphs 6.51. I would specifically highlight the detailed evidence and assessment that's contained within that in relation to the adaptation of existing and future housing stock to accommodate ageing populations, and the suitability of that approach to both meet the expressed choices of those who will benefit from that stock, and indeed in terms of the sources of likely supply over the plan period.
Okay, thank you. I mean, in terms of the need for older persons accommodation, it would equate, given my notes, to roughly 98 C3 dwellings per annum and 23 units of C2 per annum. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. That is what the Schma details.
Some authorities would set a target, if you like, in terms of, seeking to secure accommodation for older people as a way to try and deliver that need. And I suppose my question comes down to how effective would the approach in policy HO5 be to enable the identified need, and that need is clearly set out. It doesn't set out a requirement, does it, as a proportion of overall development. So it's just, I suppose, in terms of how effective would the policy be in terms of meeting that need for older persons accommodation. And I think in terms of, there's a bit of echo going on there. There's just conversation going on up there. I'm just going to continue because I don't want to lose any more time. So I think there's a discussion around whether there should be a more precise target, but also in terms of this approach of adaptation of existing development, and I suppose the extent to which the council can influence that through the plan.
If I may, I'll speak to some of my own experiences elsewhere and how that sort of approach has worked or not worked. I think the council would acknowledge that there are a variety of ways that this could be approached. Some I don't think any of those approaches are necessarily wrong or right. They are just approaches. I think in many cases the types of specialised older person accommodation, which the policy speaks to and which the SMAR speaks to, are in the main market-led, and indeed how they distribute across places and to specific locations is, in my experience, to a greater extent controlled by the market and the market's ability to secure properties rather than guided by any specific figures. And that certainly has been my experience of this in Surrey hinterland authorities, where for no particular reason specialised elderly person accommodation has gravitated to a location for market reasons rather than there being a specific target, and indeed as a consequence those market reasons have resulted in oversupply, and indeed there's oversupply at the district or borough level, I should say, and as a consequence, it's almost a particular borough or district providing a strategic level of provision rather than meeting specific local need. So I think within that respect, the council would suggest that its approach will be effective. I don't know if David wishes to speak on any experiences he can draw upon in relation to actual real-world situations where market demand has manifested itself in the borough. My own experiences over the last year is that there's I won't say little market interest because that's a small sample of 12 months, but there is limited market interest to gravitate towards Lewisham for that highly specialised, for those highly specialised forms of accommodation. Obviously, that doesn't mean that there's no need. Quite the opposite. I think it just demonstrates that the council's approach to meeting local need through conventional forms of housing is an appropriate one for Lewisham. Thank you.
Well, I think it would be interesting to know what the sort of past delivery of accommodation for older people has been, you know, and why the council thinks this particular approach would work well in Lewisham. You know, what are the local factors that the council considers would justify this particular approach in Lewisham. I hear what you're saying. There are different approaches that can be taken, but also this issue of retrofitting. You know, that to what degree really can there be an influence over that through the planning system?
Yes, in terms of retrofitting, you know, very little in terms of monitoring control, because it wouldn't interface or touch with, you know, the kind of planning system essentially. Carol is correct in saying that there is little demand, but we have had demand for this specialist housing, and I think we have a nice picture of specialist housing, Hazelhurst Court, which accompanies HO5, which is specialist housing that was built towards the south of the borough. We have had interest from developers recently, one particular developer looking at this. So I think the borough would not necessarily be discouraging this type of development in appropriate locations, in a kind of appropriate form, and certainly as the SHMA suggests, there is a kind of need there to meet, and we would welcome that. I think Carol was right that this is generally kind of market-led, and if a developer came and had a site and it was appropriate, then we would be happy to work with them to deliver it.
My apologies. If I may come back on just briefly on the issue of retrofitting, again, local authorities within their wider corporate functions are known to promote such activities, particularly through housing renewal or regeneration, and indeed there is nothing. There's nothing to prevent the council from going down that route with its partners in the future in terms of retrofitting. I think that a point that deserves to be made, and no doubt will be teased out in future discussions at the examination hearings, is around the quality of new provision and its ability to endure as, I don't like the term, personally don't like the term lifetime homes, but endure for residents across their lifespans and be adaptable. And I think that is something that we can, as placemakers, legitimately influence through what we are doing. I would echo, and perhaps I didn't articulate this very well, the issue around the matter around choice, that the council is not seeking to prevent other forms of residential accommodation that meet this specific area of need from coming forward. It is simply a case of demonstrating what that level of need is within Lewisham. I mentioned the sort of apocryphal example from Surrey, where a local authority found itself meeting a much wider need. Obviously, if that is something that can be demonstrated on a case-by-case basis through the decision-taking process, then that is for potential applicants, development partners to come forward and justify it, that the policy is sufficiently flexible to accommodate those sorts of approaches.
Thank you. I'm conscious of time. Just a couple of points I wanted to pick up, which have been raised by participants who aren't here. But in relation to the HBF point about including London Plan target in the policy, what's the council's view on that?
I'm very sorry, Inspector Malloy. Could you repeat the question? I didn't quite hear all of it.
I've got a note of one of the HBF's representations which suggest that there should be reference to the London Plan target for older persons accommodation. I think it's 100 dwellings per annum. What's the council's view? I just wanted to give you the opportunity to respond to it.
Yeah, absolutely. We can refer to that strategic target. Obviously, it doesn't disaggregate down to a kind of borough level, but happy to cross-reference that.
Is it in the supporting text? That may be a better location for it potentially.
It's not at the moment, I don't think. We can't.
I think we were just discussing that, it's a London Plan target. It's not necessarily the Lewisham target. So I think if reference were to be included to the London Plan target, it might be better in the supporting text. That's just our view off the cuff, but I'm happy to take the council's view on that.
Yes, we'd be happy to include it within the supporting text.
I think the only other point on this policy is another representative point in relation to the viability study and how specialist housing for older people had been dealt with as part of that. I think the representation alluded to the fact that the viability study at paragraph 2.43 stated that as for specialist housing for older people, we have tested the impact of the London Plan policy, which applies a policy approach for general needs housing to this sector. And I think the suggestion is that that hasn't necessarily been carried through the viability assessment. I just wanted to flag that up as a point because it has been raised. And it may be that the Council would like to take time to look at that particular point and come back, rather than waste hearing time doing that.
Yes, we can take that away and come back on that matter.
We could come back to it in the viability session anyway. I'm very conscious that participants have been very patient, so I was going to suggest that we move on to purpose-built student accommodation, so that we ensure that we can cover that in today's session, if participants are happy with that approach. So just you have to remind me to go back to policy H06. So in terms of student accommodation, what is the evidence in relation to the need for purpose-built student accommodation, and would the approach set out in policy H07 enable that need to be met? If I can start with the Council, please.
So in terms of purpose-built student accommodation, there is a kind of regional assessment done by the London Plan, which identified 3,500 purpose-built student accommodation bed spaces to be provided annually over the plan period. Again, what it doesn't do is disaggregate that target down to a Lewisham level per se. There is evidence within our strategic housing market assessment in terms of looking at the number of students within the borough. We took a look at the census information. We have taken advice from our universities on demand. We also looked at council tax records for student discount, etc., to understand the existing and potential future need for purpose-built student accommodation. I mean, I think in general we have a policy which encourages purpose-built student accommodation in the correct location. I think the Council's only concern is about over-concentration of purpose-built student accommodation, and maybe we can have a discussion about over-concentration and how we test that. But it is something that we are acutely aware of, given the amount of applications and pre-application discussions that we're having with developers. But certainly providing student accommodation within appropriate locations is very much part of our plan and part of the discussions that we're having with development partners. Angela, is there anything specifically you want to mention in terms of the SHMA?
I guess just to add that we looked at some of the committed supply that we've had in our borough, and as of at 2021, we had already approved 1,686 student beds. And since then, we have had a proliferation of pre-apps coming forward.
When you say you'd already, so that was at 20, it was at a snapshot in time at 2021?
Yes, that was within the, that was within the SHMA. I guess we could provide an update on that if needed. But what the evidence pointed to in the SHMA was the fact that it's difficult to, because we haven't got a borough target like we do with the affordable housing target from the London plan, it's difficult to estimate how we're contributing to the overall London picture, but it did say that we were contributing significantly to the wider need for London.
Is that not picked up in monitoring, in terms of monitoring the London plan, the contribution from each borough? Is that being overly optimistic on my behalf?
I'm afraid you're probably being slightly optimistic in terms of the monitoring. Yes, it is picked up, but it is something that a number of local authorities have been highlighting to the GLA as a particular concern. I think generally there is a balance to be struck here, because we accept, and London accepts, that student accommodation and promoting London for students is a good thing, both in terms of our universities and colleges, etc., but also kind of economically within the capital and within Lewisham. However, there does appear to be a over-concentration or a concentration of purpose-built student accommodations within, dare I say, a handful of boroughs, and we are meeting with the GLA and discussing this. What isn't clear to us is whether or not that strategic regional level is actually being mapped geographically, so that we can understand whether there is any issues of clustering and any potential problems with that. With all that being said, I don't want to paint the picture that Lewisham doesn't think that student accommodation is part of a mixed and balanced approach to redevelopment of its sites. And again, we are working with partners on strategic sites within our town centres, which we believe fundamentally are appropriate locations for purpose-built student accommodation as part of a wider offer and mix.
Okay, thank you. I'm conscious of points raised by participants, and I think if we could look to break those down, and I think there was a point raised in relation to the evidence that's been used in order to assess the need for student accommodation. So I think we can look at that first, and then we can move on to the policy approach in the policy itself and look at the components of that. So on that basis, I'd like to bring in your tribe first, and obviously, but what I would suggest, given the time, if there are additional points to be made by other participants on that, if you could try not to repeat any points that have already been raised, that would be helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Thanks. So the point we made in our statement is around the lack of use of more recent data on the student accommodation and where students are living, because they're two different things. The supply of purpose-built student accommodation is one set of data, but the presence of students living within HMOs, within private rented accommodation and living at home is another set of data, and there doesn't seem to be an acknowledgement of the characteristics of the wider student housing market in terms of providing up-to-date evidence that says this is how many students there are living currently in different parts of the borough, and this is where the types of accommodation that they are living in. So that's just the point we made. I think overall, the fact that Lewisham acknowledges that there is a need for more PBSA, we clearly agree with that. The point we're trying to get at is, and I don't want to stray on beyond the evidence question, but the evidence does not point to the policy in its current form. The evidence doesn't tell you why that policy should be the way it is in our view, and we kind of come on to that in terms of how does the evidence that is based on pretty out-of-date census data, how does that lead to the policy approach that's been proposed, is the challenge we put to the policy as currently drafted.
So just to be clear, it's the evidence in relation to the existing student population within Lewisham that you consider as not necessarily being taken into account?
Yeah, precisely. It's based on census data that is fairly historic at this point, and clearly COVID disrupted the latest census, but there are other sources of data that could have been employed that are produced by other statistics agencies, specifically in relation to students, student accommodation, and there's also council tax data available as well. So with that in mind, the first point is this data probably isn't the best set of data that there is around student accommodation and its need. And the second point is there is still a gap between what that evidence tells you and what the policy is presenting.
We'll come back to the policy approach and how that links into the evidence. I'd obviously just wanted to give the council the opportunity to come back to that. I know you mentioned use of council tax data in your summary there. Can you just come back on those points in terms of the existing student population?
Yes, within the SHMO at paragraph 6.79, that did look at the council tax data, and in particular the student discount that is applied on council tax properties. And that demonstrated that we have 1,013 dwellings across the borough who are wholly occupied by students.
Can you repeat that number again? 1,013 or 13?
1,013.
13.
Yeah. Dwellings, and those are occupied by students. There is a fairly equal spread across the borough, but more so a concentration in the north and the west sub-areas. So that data is from 2021.
And how is that fed into the overall assessment of need presented in the SHMO? Because obviously it does refer to 2011 census data as well. How is it sort of reconciled, those two data sources, if you like?
I think the SHMO recognises that purpose-built student accommodation is necessary in addition to conventional housing where students are already living. So providing purpose-built student accommodation sort of releases the general housing market back to other residents in the borough that is required. So we do see that that is a thing that needs to happen. I guess the evidence then goes on to demonstrate that we have already got a committed supply, 1,686 units, and albeit that is from 2021, so that does need to be updated, I guess.
And is there given the assessment of demand, if you like, and supply, is there a net need, an estimate of net need on that basis, taking into account the supply pipeline, if you like?
It's a very difficult thing to determine, because I think, as the respondent made clear, is that again we talk about the London housing market, and it is not necessarily the case that people living in purpose-built student accommodations necessarily go to universities or colleges within Lewisham. They may very well be going to Greenwich universities, etc., in neighbouring boroughs. So it's very difficult to assess what the actual need is, and in the absence of the London plan disaggregating to a kind of a borough level, it's difficult then to establish a sort of target. I guess, again, you know, just to reiterate that the council is not seeking a ban on purpose-built student accommodation. We are saying that in appropriate locations, and we do feel that, you know, the policy is robust in terms of we want these purpose-built student accommodations in well-located places within our town centres. Seems like a logical approach to a policy. But also that we have to be mindful about the over-concentration of purpose-built student accommodation and the effect that it has on our conventional C3 housing, which is the fundamental need that we have within the borough.
Okay, thank you. Would you like to respond to that?
Yes, I think that we understand that, but the council seems to be making this jump from acknowledging that PBSA has a benefit to general needs housing in that it is capable of releasing general needs housing back to the general housing market, and I suspect that the council is in a similar position to many London boroughs in that its temporary housing bill is significant, and that it has a lot of people it would rather be housing in conventional C3 housing than in temporary housing. So the council's correct, I think, in acknowledging that, but it's then jumping to the point saying, but there's no, but there's sort of, it's impossible to quantify the need, and also bringing in this point about over-concentration, which again, there's no evidence in anything that has been presented about where that comes from. And I know that the over-concentration point and the rest of the policy you might come on to next, it's just the council is kind of saying one thing and then trying to sort of morph that into an argument to support something different. I mean, the London plan, it doesn't disaggregate the student accommodation target on the basis that, absolutely correctly, student accommodation markets are not neatly borough specific. People studying in boroughs cross borough boundaries frequently to study, work, etc. But the London plan is clear. Boroughs should seek to ensure that local and strategic need for PBSA is addressed, and it sets out a list of criteria that would be applied in the context of accommodation being delivered anywhere in London, and ensure that accommodation meets all of these points that make it successful student accommodation. And by the borough kind of not giving a clear view on how they perceive their need to be and just providing a kind of generic statement of support, yet in the policy prevent that assessment being made in terms of London Plan H15. I'm just not quite clear how that policy's been arrived at on the basis of what the London Plan sets out and what the council's own evidence says.
So I think your point really, I think we need to move on to the policy approach. I think there seems to be an acceptance that the evidence isn't perfect. And if you have any suggestions for improving that evidence, and obviously the council said they have looked at council tax information in terms of the existing population, in, you know, also looking at census data, but because of the you know, the complication and the cross-boundary issues, it's quite difficult to, you know, to quantify the need in the borough. I think so. Unless you have a suggested way forward in terms of reconciling those issues in terms of the evidence, then, you know, I'm not sure we're going to go much further on that point. But I think your concern really comes back to the evidence to support an over-concentration. I'm just trying to sort of get to the nub of the issue to speed things up a little bit. So would that be a fair summary of your point? So I think that is one of the key points, isn't it? The evidence to support the approach in the policy in terms of the concern raised in relation to the over-concentration point. So on that basis, I'm going to put that question to the council to explain its approach and whether there's evidence there to support that particular approach in the policy.
Yes, I mean, obviously we looked at the number of approvals in terms of bed space that we had approved, albeit at a particular point in time through the SHMA. We can certainly update that and provide evidence again of a number of schemes that we've approved since then. I think the key point that I want to make is having a policy which puts the emphasis on demonstrating there is demand doesn't necessarily preclude purpose-built student accommodation. I understand the point about over-concentration, but it is something that we fundamentally need to address as a London borough, you know, particularly when we are seeing applicants who have planning permissions for conventional C3 housing, then flipping that to purpose-built student accommodation because the viability is better. Again, we are not precluding purpose-built student accommodation in appropriate locations, in appropriate schemes, in appropriate forms, but we are trying to tackle the real and genuine problem of over-concentration, particularly within the kind of the areas like Lewisham Town Centre, where we do have to have a balanced community living there, and it's a policy and a mechanism that tries to address that approach.
I think that this term over-concentration has been used in a couple of policies, and I suppose I think that the point was made, and apologies for putting words into people's mouths. I'm just trying to speed things up. But in terms of the, you know, well, what is the harm? If there were to be an over-concentration, what's the harm in that? You know, what concerns would there be from having a concentration of a student population? I think that point was raised. But I think, you know, from, again, Section 78 hat on, you know, how would that over-concentration be measured in terms of the effectiveness of the policy? So if you could address those 2 points.
Yes, I mean, in terms of the harm, you know, I think, as I said, what we're trying to create is a mixed and balanced community, and we're trying to ensure that there is, in all of our town centres, in all of our areas, that this type of accommodation would be appropriate, that there is an appropriate balance. So I think, you know, if we simply allowed all sites to be developed as purpose-built student accommodation, I strongly believe that wouldn't be good placemaking, and it certainly wouldn't be the type of environment and the type of place that we'd want to encourage. We do need to develop mixed and balanced communities. That said, again, reiterate the point that as part of a mixed and balanced communities, there is, you know, absolutely huge benefits in having a student population within our town centres. So I guess the crux of the matter is about over-concentration and what is that kind of level, and that's the question that you have asked us, and I think it's a fair point. We haven't put that, we haven't got a figure there. I know that some boroughs are looking into this in terms of what that would mean in terms of whether it's a kind of percentage of students as part of a kind of population of a town centre, for example. But it seems to us that it's quite a difficult one to quantify. And I guess I'm just being, you know, as open as possible that, you know, we have this concern. We're trying to introduce a policy that will help us through the development management process to avoid the over-concentration, but recognising that the policy isn't perfect.
Just playing devil's advocate, so a scheme comes in for student accommodation, the council refuses it on the grounds of there being, too high a concentration of student accommodation. How would the council then defend that appeal? What evidence would it put to the inspector at that appeal to support its case?
So I think what we would look at is the town centre boundary. If it's in a town centre boundary, we'd look at the town centre boundary. We'd look at the number of units existing within that town centre boundary and potentially proposed with the scheme, and then look at the concentration of or the amount of purpose-built student accommodation within that area, to draw a judgment on a professional judgment on whether or not the amount of student beds and the amount of purpose-built student accommodation that's in the town centre creates a mixed and balanced community. Now, I guess the question is what that percentage is or what that calculation is. But again, we would use professional judgment here. The development management process is predicated on professional judgment in terms of coming up with a good decision. And again, I just want to reiterate the point that this isn't about a ban on purpose-built student accommodation. It is simply about trying to avoid this particular issue.
I mean, one has to observe from a Section 78 point of view, and obviously I've done a few as well as you, Ma'am. The exercise of planning judgment is a quintessential part of the appeal process. I mean, this policy does set out in Little Roman 1 and 2 a number of factors to be considered as part of that judgment about over-concentration, but it's not illegitimate for a local plan policy to include a term of art which then requires the exercise of planning judgment both at the application stage, the decision-making stage, and ultimately at the appellate stage. That's just sometimes, trying to be overly prescriptive would be, in some ways, a worse, or at least potentially a worse outcome if there's a strict numerical limit which can't be gone behind or beyond. Whereas this policy seeks to allow it to be a matter of sensible judgment.
I imagine we'd be here for much longer discussing the matter if there were prescriptive parameters put in the policy as well in terms of where those parameters lie. I would just like to bring, sorry, I can't recall your name, but I'm conscious you haven't spoken yet, so if you'd like to come in now.
Thank you. Firstly, I agree with everything that your tribe has said, but I think the problem, with the term over-concentration, sorry, I'll take a step back. It's good to hear that the policy has not been drafted in a way that is meant to prohibit student accommodation coming forward, and as a consultant that does a lot of this sort of work across London, that's kind of rare because most authorities kind of going out their way to make it as hard as possible to deliver student accommodation. So the cynic in me reads this policy with that in mind. One of the problems with talking about over-concentration is that you're setting the applicant up to fail, because you've just said, and your policy says, we want to see student accommodation in a certain location. You've said you actively encourage it into Lewisham Town Centre, for example. I agree, that is a great location for it. You also talk about it going close to universities or in proximity or words to that effect. Fine. So if we accept that there is need, and we accept that people will want to develop that sort of accommodation, and we accept therefore that they have to go to a certain location, inevitably you'll have concentration of that use. We can't then define what over-concentration means from the sounds of it. So I appreciate the planning judgment point, but I certainly don't think we should be having numbers, you know, put how many beds, you know, should be provided, and there be a, you know, and you haven't done that, but I would certainly resist that sort of thing, because it becomes very difficult to manage that. You also mentioned mixed and balanced communities, which, and the, I suppose the ambition to achieve that, which again, I don't disagree if that's in the London plan, but it's also not really defined anywhere. And we often come across that in our planning discussions with people as to how are you achieving a mixed and balanced community. Well, that can be viewed in many, many different ways. I would like to see the over-concentration point taken out of the policy. We understand what, I guess generally speaking, what you're trying to achieve, but it's problematic to have it in the policy because it's just not a defined point. So how can we address it in any planning application? How does a developer know whether they should pursue a site or not, because you may or may not think there is over-concentration? And sorry, just to final, so in that sense, I don't think it's effective to have it in, because you know it becomes just very unclear to somebody outside of the council's office what is meant by that and how you will address it, and whether there's an open door or whether they just should move on and focus their attention somewhere else.
Are you going to help us with a way forward?
Well, I don't know about that necessarily, but one has to take a step back here. This is a particular type of accommodation with particular characteristics and particular effects. And that's why it has its own policy regime. Now, as soon as you accept that proposition, it seems to me the obvious corollary is that there comes a point where having too much of this particular type of accommodation in a particular location is going to be harmful, particularly to the objective of developing mixed and balanced communities, which is a fundamental objective. And therefore, one can't simply say, well, there's no need for any form of control. And the use of the term over-concentration, although it's difficult to define in precise numerical terms, is nevertheless able to be given a degree of planning judgment applied to it to come up with a meaningful answer, such that it is an important protection against this one unique type of accommodation taking over in a particular area, bluntly, in a way that becomes harmful. So we would say there has to be a control there. Now, obviously, in the real world, developers don't just march in and slap an application on the council table and say, have a look at this lot. You know, there will be pre-application discussions. There will be an opportunity for developers to understand the lie of the land in the broadest of terms, and to therefore see how the judgment is likely to be made by the council on this issue of over-concentration. And ultimately, if they fundamentally disagree with that, then they have the option of the appellate route. And so, given that your options really are to, as the other side would seem to suggest, to get rid of this entirely, this protection, and have no protection, or have a method of protection which has its limitations and uncertainties, but nevertheless exists and can be made effective, you know, we'd say obviously you should plump for that.
I do wonder, and again I'm thinking out loud, which I really shouldn't do, but in terms of the listening to the council's approach, I think the council is more potentially recognises the benefits of student accommodation, possibly more so than the wording of the policy necessarily reflects. So I was just listening to the discussion and reading this at the same time. The development proposals for purpose-built student accommodation will only be supported is quite negative. there has been a lot of reference to, you know, that could be flipped a little bit in terms of, you know, keeping it less weighted, if you like, so that, you know, or you could be more positive. Student accommodation would be supported where it is demonstrated that. There has been a lot of discussion from the council's point of view about mixed and balanced communities. I don't see that reference in the policy. And I think that's really, isn't it, what the council is trying, that's the objective behind the policy, is to ensure that the, you know, student accommodation doesn't override that objective, if you like. So I think it would be helpful if the wording of the policy was looked at, including reference to mixed and balanced communities, and possibly, and I'm just floating this suggestion, integrating the council's concerns, but without necessarily being as over-prescriptive in relation to the use of the term harmful overconcentration. You know, so that the need to consider mixed and the objective of achieving mixed and balanced communities. If you can see where I'm heading, I'm just trying to suggest a way forward.
We can take that away. I mean, I take your point, because I mean, in reality, as an inquiry advocate, one would suggest that the only be supported phrase, you would probably try and argue that that was, you know, a more restrictive form of words than others. Although, I mean, in logical terms, it probably doesn't make any difference, but as a matter of impression, it might. But then we'll take that away and have a think about.
Isn't it the objective behind the policy? And from listening to the council's approach and its view on student accommodation, it's not against student accommodation per se. It's more about achieving that sort of mixed and balanced communities. And I think it could possibly achieve, you know, address the concerns that you may have, but in a slightly different way. And I'm happy to take views on that from participants who have, you know, raised concerns about that particular approach. I'm just trying to find a way to move forward on it.
Thank you.
To start off.
Thank you. I was just wanting to sort of not necessarily return all the way and recycle the overconcentration point, but if we all agree that PBSA is part of the council and London Plan's housing delivery, and it is documented in the kind of government's housing delivery test measurement rulebook that it is based on that there's a ratio of 2.5 student beds equaling 1 traditional C3 dwelling, that is based on the amount of self-contained housing this form of supply will free up. How can you then have over-concentration of a student accommodation use where the point is these students are generally already living in these areas? People aren't trying to apply for planning permission for PBSA in completely untested locations, in completely untested parts of London. The reason why Lewisham may perceive themselves to be receiving lots of PBSA applications is not just to do with PBSA, it's to do with lots of other economic factors that we won't go into now. But it's because you already have a population of students that would like to be housed in more appropriate accommodation, and in doing so there is a double win in terms of providing students with purpose-built accommodation that does not have them dealing with private landlords and the complexities of that. It provides them with bedrooms of a certain size that allows the council to control the quality of the accommodation, and it allows the council to be dealing with a single operator most of the time, so that there's a kind of, and it allows the council to condition and put obligations on that operator in terms of student management. So in terms of the harm of overconcentration, this is not allowing unregulated large amounts of a particular type of occupant. This is actually, student accommodation is not what it once was in terms of the tools that the council has to its disposal to control the types of development, but also this big aspect that we all agree it is capable of releasing traditional C3 accommodation. So how are you over-concentrating if you're also at the same time releasing traditional C3 development? And that's what you've said at the opening, and that's what the London plan is clear on, and that's also written in the draft local plan. I just don't see how you would ever be able to measure over-concentration if you're also correctly factoring in the amount of traditional housing that is then freed up by the delivery of that student accommodation.
Just picking on a point, I think, that was raised in representations, the fact that in monitoring terms, that student accommodation would class as, I can't remember the exact ratio, if you remind me.
It's 2.5 student bedrooms is the equivalent to 1 traditional dwelling, and that's repeated in the draft local plan, that's in the London plan, and that is in the government's housing delivery test measurement rulebook. So a developer delivering student accommodation doesn't prevent the council from meeting its housing target and being measured in the housing delivery test. It doesn't affect that, as far as I understand.
And I suppose it's the question that if that student accommodation counts towards general C3 housing, why should it be treated differently, potentially?
Exactly. If it's capable of being counted towards housing delivery as per the relevant targets that are applied by the government and the GLA through the London plan, then there shouldn't be an ability to try and restrict how that is delivered, because it's not then compliant with the NPPF around the overall supply of homes, particularly when we consider the fact that this type of accommodation frees up capacity in the general needs housing sector, which is, I believe, common ground amongst us and would be with the GLA. So we're not talking about, there just physically can't be such a thing as over-concentration, because you are always having this moving a type of people that are already living in general needs housing into purpose-built accommodation.
I think I'm just storing up a few points for the council to come back on. I think the other point that was raised in representations was it was put forward as a potential conflict within the policy in terms of the need for student accommodation to be located in accessible locations, and how that there's this inherent tension in the policy there. So if the council could pick up on that point in addition to the other points raised.
In terms of the over-concentration, I'd just like to, make a kind of case study. If, for example, we took a site allocation which is allocated for 2,000 homes, and in our town centres with, commercial non-residential floor space, and if we were to say that would be comprised of, say, 6 blocks, towers of any scale, are we really saying that if we were to deliver 6 purpose-built student accommodation blocks within that site, that wouldn't somehow be harmful to our town centre? Would that be really creating a mixed and balanced community within our town centres? Does that create and does that offer the demographic of people, the age range of people that you need within a town centre to support a mixed and balanced community? And I think that's all that we're trying to resolve, is that, again, as part of the mix of people, of backgrounds, etc., we want to have mixed and balanced communities, and therefore, the council just does not accept that if we build every one of our site allocations for purpose-built student accommodations within our town centres, that is an appropriate response. And You know, that is what we're trying to avoid and trying to control. You know, I reiterate, as part of a comprehensive scheme, as part of a wider regeneration area and growth area, absolutely, purpose-built student accommodation is part of that mix, and you know that will be based on a kind of balanced and professional judgment, which we are doing as a council, and we can certainly provide information which updates the SHMA evidence to show that we are still making positive decisions on purpose-built student accommodation in the correct locations as part of that mixed and balanced community.
Yeah, it's acknowledging that you know, the SHMA identifies need for other types of housing as well, general market housing, affordable housing, housing for older people. So student accommodation is part of that overall equation, isn't it? And I think in terms of your particular point in relation to, you know, if an application came in, it's easier to measure, isn't it, in relation to a particular site and the mix on a particular site. I think it's harder, I think, to measure this over-concentration point within a wider area, within a town centre, isn't it? I think that's part of the problem. I am very conscious of time. We do have another session this afternoon. I do think there is scope, though, to look at the wording of the policy. I can see both sides of the argument. I think there is scope to look at the wording of the policy. I think particularly in relation to mixed and balanced communities, I think there's some wording in the MPPF along those lines, isn't there? I think it's more in relation to first homes, but I think that there is some useful wording in the MPPF, and I think it would be useful to look at the overall approach and criteria on Part A in terms of will only be supported, which I think sets quite a negative tone, and looking at redrafting the policy to include reference to mixed and balanced communities, just to be maybe slightly less prescriptive on this harmful over-concentration point. You know, and I don't know what the participants would feel about, you know, taking a slightly different approach to the wording of the policy.
I just raised that the London Plan Policy H15A1 says, you know, boroughs should seek to ensure that at the neighbourhood level, the development contributes to a mixed and inclusive neighbourhood. So to take your example, should somebody come forward with 3,000 PBSA units, which would probably be the entire first year demand of a fairly large London university, so I think the likelihood of that is probably quite rare. Is the London Plan policy insufficient at dealing with something like that at that scale? I think for us, the London Plan allows boroughs to assess at a neighbourhood level and to assess mixed and inclusive neighbourhood. And I think I would suggest that that wording is probably entirely suitable for this, and that would allow the borough to review any planning application coming forward against what a mixed and inclusive neighbourhood looks like.
Thank you for that suggestion. I think that wording is not dissimilar to the wording that the council has used quite frequently in the discussion, and it would be consistent with the London Plan. Did you have a view?
Yeah, I mean, for sort of speed and ease, I'd be happy to sort of work on some drafting. Perhaps the three parties could sort of work together on it. I think the questions you were asking, David, are you know, they are exactly the right questions, and the scenario you gave, I agree that doesn't sound like a great use of a site allocation. But those questions are kind of better questions than just a blanket over concentration statement, as it were. So yeah, I'm happy to, if if your inspectors would like us to do that, if you would welcome it as well, then some changes to the overall theme of the policy to make it a bit more positive and a bit clearer as to how to get to the objective that you're trying to achieve. I'd be happy to do that. I don't know how you intend to sort of finish off the rest of this session, and there's the one on the policy H08 to do with co-living as well. The points I would raise in that are very similar to the points we've been talking about here.
Just in terms of the other points, before we move on, there were points raised in relation to the London Plan affordable requirement on this policy. In terms of, am I right in that? In terms of summarising the points raised, were there any issues in relation to the reference to the London Plan affordable requirement of 30%? I think I raised the question, should that be included in the policy itself as opposed to the supporting text? So that was probably more my question, actually, thinking about it.
That was us, thank you. It's a very quick point about consistency and clarity. Currently, the draft policy H07 doesn't kind of make it specific that PBSA schemes coming forward with 35% affordable housing would be eligible for fast track, which is the position now set out in the relevant London Plan policy. Our suggestion is that that wording is inserted into policy H07 in the local plan, just to make it clear. Just to support that position, draft policy H03 in the local plan, genuinely affordable housing, does talk about the fast track route and aligns therefore with the London Plan policy. So our suggestion is to insert that same wording into H07, just so there's no confusion potentially as to what is and isn't the position when schemes come forward about that 35% fast track route. Thank you.
I knew I'd read that representation somewhere, thank you. Does the council have a view on that?
I don't think that should be a problem, yeah, just referencing the London Plan, yeah.
Thank you. It's just worth sitting here for 4 hours for that, so thank you.
Just to be clear, it would be cross-referencing to the London Plan policy as opposed to necessarily replicating the wording in there into the H03.
I mean, it's no, it doesn't matter to us personally. Either it's a cross-reference or repeating the wording as it's set out in H03, which is it amounts to the same thing.
I mean, it's already in the explanatory text at 7.59. The council had previously been cautious about, I think the phrase we used in correspondence was regurgitating the London Plan content. But we can take that away, and given that we're going to have a think about the wording of the policy, we'll come to a fixed position on that, if we may.
I'm not generally a fan of cross-referencing in the sense that a plan should be read as a whole, but it could be raised as an effectiveness point, a legibility point, couldn't it, I guess, in terms of just making it clear to the reader and to developers what the position is.
Yeah, it's just about clarity and precision, nothing more fundamental than that.
I think we're fine with that, yeah. We can take it away whilst we look at the wording of that policy overall.
Make best use of time while we have participants here on that particular policy. Is H08 you raised in relation to housing with the shared facilities, HMOs. Very similar points in terms of the overconcentration, is that right?
Yeah, I mean, we don't need to dwell on it too much. It's the same real points. It's the sort of general tone of the policy I perceive to be a bit on the negative side, and particularly around, I think the word that they use in this part of the policy is proliferation rather than over-concentration. I'm trying to get the relevant policy up. So I guess we would just, it's the same point. It's how are we defining proliferation or over-concentration, and you know, again, given that it's, in fact, it's kind of even more relevant here because co-living is just housing. It houses people. It's not restricted to a particular type of person, and you know, now there are quite a lot of schemes up and running. Data is certainly indicating that it's a really broad cross-section of society that's living in it. So I'm unclear why it's a problem to have a proliferation, if that's the phrase used, or over-concentration. It's just people living their lives in smaller accommodation for rent.
I think just looking at the council's response, I think you know, given the need for family-sized accommodation, there's potentially you know, an issue there in terms of not losing family-sized accommodation, not wanting to preempt the council's response. But I do wonder whether, you know, a similar way forward to the student accommodation point in relation to, you know, mixed and inclusive neighbourhoods, or whatever the wording could be used in order to achieve the same objective but be slightly less negative.
Yeah, we can look at this. I think there is there's 2 points here, and I think it's you know, one relates to small HMOs and the proliferation of small HMOs versus the co-living model that the respondent is drawing our attention to. I mean, what we have seen and what we have got is a huge amount of evidence on small HMOs and the proliferation of small HMOs, particularly within our existing family neighbourhoods, causing significant issues and a harmful effect. And that is something that we feel strongly about, that we have to control. The council has an Article 4 direction covering the entire borough now, which is a point of modification that we have to bring up with this plan. We have got the Article 4 direction in place for the entire borough to be able to control, you know, where small HMOs are appropriate, and how they are then managed. And the council is looking at proactive licensing schemes for those small HMOs. I think the product that the respondent is referring to is the large homes in multiple occupation and the co-living products. And again, what I'd say there is that the council is supportive of those products in appropriate locations as part of a mixed and balanced community. It is a very different type of product, obviously, than the small HMOs.
Just worth observing, actually, that the wording of policy H08, when it talks about HMOs generally, does talk about inclusive and mixed neighbourhoods. And it's only with respect to large-scale accommodation that the term proliferation is used. So it's important to ground it properly in what the policy actually says.
And just in terms of Part A, Criterion B, given that there's reference to the contribution to inclusive mixed neighbourhoods, is there a need for this harmful overconcentration reference? It has been consistent in relation to the potential approach on student accommodation.
I think in relation to small HMOs, the phrase harmful overconcentration is a fairly tried and tested phrase across many local plans. I think if we can separate the two particular models, the council would like to maintain the wording for parts A and parts B in terms of our approach, and we do have the evidence to support in terms of the harmful impact that overconcentration of small HMOs have. I'd certainly be willing to look at parts C, which is the large-scale purpose-built shared living accommodation, i.e. the co-living, and reflect on the type of language that we're suggesting as part of the purpose-built student accommodation.
You say about having the evidence to demonstrate the potential harmful effects of the overconcentration of HMOs, presumably help to support the Article 4 direction. Is that evidence available?
Yes, it is, and it has been submitted as a submission document. Let me just see, EB18 HMO review and evidence paper. We had hoped to have the author of that work with us. Unfortunately, he's suffering with COVID, but he would speak very articulately and authoritatively on that subject.
Okay, thank you. Given the time, I shall look at that in my own time. Just in relation to the suggestion to revisit Part C, is that something that would be welcomed?
Yeah, absolutely.
I think it's Part D, actually, sorry.
I'm conscious of time because the council and ourselves have another session this afternoon. So I think there are some outstanding matters on the agenda: supported and specialist accommodation, self-build and custom-build housing. I was going to mention in relation to self-build and custom-build housing that we don't have a particular issue with the approach in there, so we're happy to take the council's evidence as read on that, if that would help speed things up. We've discussed HO8, so really it's the supported and specialist accommodation, and also gypsy and traveller accommodation, which I am conscious Mr. Hall had a point in relation to that. Looking at the time, and giving the need for ourselves to have some level of comfort break, I think it's going to be difficult to deal with that today. I am conscious, I think, that your case is here partially to look at that issue. I was thinking that we could look, because we have a lighter session the afternoon of Wednesday the 26th of June. it's just a mop-up, if you like, of other housing policies. There could be scope there to...
We discussed this because the idea was floated, I think, at the mid-morning break. My diary makes me available to come on that Wednesday, and I've just had instructions that the council would like me to, which is very nice of them. So if that works, then it works logistically on our side.
Mr. Hall?
Sorry, could you just, I didn't quite catch whether it was morning or afternoon.
It's the afternoon, 2 p.m, Wednesday the 26th of June. Are you available then?
I'll make myself available. Thank you.
Did you wish to make a further point? I'm conscious your nameplates are on.
There was just one more point on the student accommodation policy. If the council is looking at changes and amending wording, is again, there's another key point in there as well as harmful overconcentration that talks about PBSA being demonstrated to not compromise the delivery of conventional housing. And many of the points that I've made are also relevant to that statement as well, in terms of if the council accepts that student accommodation is capable of freeing up conventional housing, that is inherent in the delivery of PBSA. So it's just that wording that I don't believe is justified, evidence-based, and it is contradictory to what the 2.5 to 1 ratio is. But I think happy to deal with that separately and wait for the council's response on that policy rather than eating into your lunch break any further.
Is that something the council could look at in
Yeah,
the rounds?
we take that away. There's a difference. I'm not going to provoke a big debate, obviously, now, but there is a difference between having a policy requirement on a sort of protective basis and responding to arguments that on this occasion the policy isn't breached, and not having the policy protection at all. And that's the issue we'll wrestle with when considering the wording as you asked us to.
Okay, well, thank you everyone for your patience. So it was quite an ambitious agenda, looking in retrospect. And thank you all for your contributions, and we shall adjourn. I'll discuss through the programme officer in terms of the timings for this afternoon session. But may be worth looking at maybe it's 2:10 if other participants don't mind waiting 10 minutes or so.
Could it perhaps be just a little longer than that? I mean, that only gives us less than half an hour to... I don't know what the food situation is, but...
Compromise 45 minutes? 45 minutes, potentially?
That would be very acceptable.
Yeah.
Very kind.
Mr. Kemp, could you notify the other participants just to let them know that we're running a little bit behind? Well,
25 past?
25 past it would be. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark.